Welcome to the Wealth Horizon podcast, where we explore the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities shaping the financial industry today. In each episode, we bring you insightful conversations with industry leaders, sharing practical, actionable strategies to help advisors deepen relationships and meet growth goals. I hope you enjoy. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Wealth Horizon. I'm so excited today because we have an actual celebrity as the guest. Joe Reilly is well known among the wealth management community, and I would say somewhat of an enigma. Joe has a long history of working with family offices, most recently with the founding of Circulus Group. Joe hosts renowned events, including the Circulus Family Office Global Investment Summit, and probably his most well-known endeavor, the Private Capital Podcast and the Inheritance Podcast. Joe is a well-known speaker at global conferences and in the financial media, and serves on several boards and councils, among other things, I'm sure. And I'm so excited to have you on our show.
Well, thank you for having me, Rosemary.
I'd love to know a little bit about what you're up to at Circulus these days first, before we get into the podcast discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Circulus is a family office network based in Greenwich, Connecticut. We're building on our successful digital platform, which includes a newsletter with about 5,000 subscribers, and the Private Capital Podcast, which is number 5 globally in family office podcasts. And we're bringing family offices face-to-face to engage with the power of ideas and build enduring relationships. The family office world, as you know, has grown dramatically in the past 10 years. Private wealth has doubled globally, and there's probably over 15,000 family offices worldwide. Family offices are taking their place adjacent to institutions, and I think a growing field needs talent and connection. I know because I was part of a family office for many years. And I think you can't automate the most interesting market knowledge or access to people and capital, which are constantly forming and reforming, much less the personal relationships and insights, unless you can meet with folks face to face. And share those ideas and make those connections. So yeah, that's what we're doing. We just did a big event in New York last fall. We had Steve Tannenbaum from Golden Tree as the keynote. It was a fabulous event. We had over 100 people, over 60 family offices and ultra high net worth. There was many billions of dollars in the room. But more importantly, it was the old friends that I had who came out, and the new friends that I've made through the podcast, the people, the families who have come to me, 35 different countries, because I have this podcast now.
That's incredible. And, so when we were talking, first we had a conversation like 2.5, maybe 3 years ago at an ultra high net worth event. And you were telling me about your podcast, and you were telling me how you had sort of promoted your podcast very organically. And then fast forward, a year later, you said to me, well, why don't you start a podcast? And I said, well, Joe, it just so happens that I am going to start a podcast and I want you to be a guest. And you said to me, well, what am I going to talk about? And I said, I want to talk to you about podcasting. And so that is what I want to focus on today, is that among the many things that you do, I think podcasting for me is very interesting, particularly in the wealth management industry. I'm starting my podcast. We work with several of our partner clients who do podcasting. And it's always sort of a sell on our part to get our wealth advisors to want to put themselves out there in that way and have those conversations. So what I want to start our discussion with is really, first of all, what made you want to start the podcast, and how did you even know how to do it? What was your process?
Sure. It really is relatively painless. And it's remarkable that we've come to this point, and I think we all kind of missed it, that there was this kind of critical mass, maybe this tipping point moment that happened maybe around 2017 or before. Social media has matured to some extent, and by that I mean everyone's on it. My mother is on Facebook. Everybody who comes out of college is on. a social networking site, and people have learned how to use these sites, and especially wealth management, which was definitely behind the curve. Folks have caught up. Mostly that's because of LinkedIn. People realize what an incredible resource LinkedIn was, and um, the emotional tone on LinkedIn tends to be more subdued, and it's more about information sharing and connection. And it's a really, frankly, a wonderful resource. But something happened also in the digital media space, and digital media are companies that are primarily online, as versus what we used to think of as print media or even television. And there was a lot of big ones that folks might have known about. There was Vice, there was Axios, there's Cheddar, there's Puck. And these are folks with a lot of funding and tried to build up a platform very quickly. But in the meantime, access to these tools became available for everyone at incredibly low cost. So things like Substack, things like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and obviously social media. For the most part, you don't have to pay for social media. And the idea that you can get your message out for almost no cost at all, and actually, in many cases, minimal effort, it has become this just magical thing, and you can become your own media company. And so I was fascinated with these digital media companies. So things you would think of things like maybe Morning Brew, there's Skift, there's Industry Dive, there's a ton of them. I listening to a podcast is how I discovered most of these groups. There used to be a podcast called Digiday, a fellow named Brian Morrissey, and he would interview all these folks starting these companies. And some of them were just newsletters that people started in college, and then they put them online and grew them to millions and millions of subscribers. But what was interesting to me was just basically how easy it was to do, and the fact that the best way to do it was to actually just start. And I was fortunate. There's a very successful and popular podcaster here in Connecticut. And I had coffee with him, and he told me, look, this is fun and it's easy to do, and you meet all kinds of great people. And it also can become a business in itself. But even if it doesn't, what's magical about this, and what I think might resonate with folks in wealth management, is that you're essentially being paid to do your own marketing, because you can sell advertising on it. You can sell advertising on the newsletter, you can sell advertising on the podcast, or you just think about the kind of reach and visibility that you get from a podcast that doesn't have to come out of your marketing budget. And that's kind of when the penny dropped. And I had been puzzling over the years about how to grow a family office network. Family office networks, obviously, there's a lot of them that exist. I used to have one here in Connecticut called Family Office Association. And what's interesting about these groups is it's hard to scale them. Families are very private. It's very hard to find them. It's very hard to get them together. You have to provide very high quality content and connection. So once you get to a few hundred members, it becomes sort of unwieldy. And I thought, well, that's a shame, because there's been so much growth in the family office space in the last 10 years. I meet so many huge family offices now, and they all have the same exact issues that I used to have when I worked in a family office. And I know they want connection. And I found connection at places like IPI and Tiger 21 and Fox in Chicago. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if you could bring a digital media company together with a family office networking group? And the digital media basically is providing the content which attracts folks into the funnel and brings them into actually to the live events and then become members. And so that has actually worked fabulously. And I think the hardest part obviously was getting started, but that actually turned out to be fine, because like I said, these platforms are very inexpensive. They're easy to use. They're intuitive. Substack, anybody can put up a website on Substack. Anybody can figure out Spotify. Anybody can figure out how to record a podcast. And so the advice that I got was to just start doing it. And so I did.
I think that's great. And I think in many cases, you are ahead of the curve slightly. But what I think is so interesting about podcasting is that, and from a marketing professional perspective, it's the only medium I've ever seen in my entire career. And I've been doing this for a long time in the wealth management industry. It's the only medium I've ever seen where people actually go back and listen to old episodes, right? And so you'll see the metrics on a particular episode, after week 1 or week 2 is a certain number, and over time you'll see it double or triple or quadruple, and you just don't see that with any other medium. And podcasting is incredibly easy, because a lot of our advisors love to talk. They talk all day long with their clients. And so when I talk to them, I'm like, you should really launch a podcast. And they're like, well, why? What would I say to anybody? I don't have anything to say. And I said, well, don't you speak to your clients all day long about particular challenges and things that they're going through and questions that they have? And this podcast would simply be a way of capturing those thoughts and making them a little bit more accessible. And I think that kind of goes to your point about the democratization of information, right? So like all of a sudden now all of us can listen to these conversations with these experts in various fields. And I think it's just an incredible tool that we have at our fingertips. So I would agree. I think it's just fascinating. I think it's great. And I'm excited that you've done this in the wealth management industry. Incredible that you're number 5. Is that a little bit surreal for you?
Yeah, it's fantastic. And to your point, uh, these things take on a life of their own. That's what's amazing about them. And I always tell the guests before I record that, I'm not a journalist. This is educational. It's designed to be evergreen. And in many cases that's what they are. We don't really necessarily talk about topical current events kind of things occasionally. Um, and that means that these things have persistence. So even my very first podcast, which was with Sebastian Mallaby, he wrote this amazing book about venture capital called The Power Law. And we had a wonderful conversation. And that podcast gets downloaded every week still, 2 years later.
Yeah.
And it's amazing the way, like as you were saying, people come into podcasts. They might know somebody. So a lot of folks this summer listened to my interview with Anthony Scaramucci. They know Anthony Scaramucci, so they're going to listen to what he has to say, and then they're like, "Wow, this is really cool. What else? Who else has this guy interviewed?"
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with Sebastian Mallaby and with all of these folks. And the other thing, which is interesting within the industry, is if you interview someone who runs a fund or who runs a large wealth management firm, the employees at the firm listen to the podcast. And obviously those folks are in the same industry as you are and probably are curious about the same things that you're curious about.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to get into it. And I always explain to folks, it's interesting because there's a lot of focus when people get into podcasting, or if you read an article about podcasting, it's a vicious power law. There's a few podcasts at the very top that have millions of downloads and make millions of dollars. And then there's, a narrower strip, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, etc. And so folks think, well, maybe this isn't worth my time. But there's a fat middle there of folks who are in your industry and in your niche. And this is the absolute best way to reach them. If you're on CNBC for 30 seconds, that's great. People get to see you, but they don't get to really understand the way you think. And they don't get to really spend a lot of time listening to you. And so the podcast allows you to do that. And then what happens is, so I'll interview Scaramucci. He'll tweet it out. He has like 1 million followers. And out of that, maybe 10,000 people will listen to it. And then out of that, maybe X number of people will subscribe. And then you move on to the next one and to the next one and to the next one. So it's incremental. Every person that you talk to adds a few subscribers, adds a few listeners, adds some people who read the newsletter. And it also increases your network, which there's a feedback loop here, because now that you've interviewed somebody, maybe somebody they know wants to talk to you, or maybe it gives you access to somebody that you were interested in talking to. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful feedback loop. And and as you watch it slowly gain incrementally over time, it's very gratifying.
Extremely. And, one of the things I think it's important to mention is that not every podcast has to have thousands of listeners, right? Not every podcast is going to have thousands of listeners. And I think that the key to the success of a podcast is knowing who is your audience and knowing what their challenges and what their interests are, right? Because if you get 100 or 200 of the exact right audience and they're listening to your podcast through to completion, right? And it's about these sort of esoteric niche topics that most of us probably are not interested in, but this one tiny sliver of the population is interested in it. and you're sort of captivating that audience, and you can see it growing over time. You know that you are talking to the exact right people. And that's what I think is so fascinating about the podcast as a medium of content. We've never seen that with commentaries. We don't see it with videos, but we do see it with podcasting. So I think that's very exciting. Um, One thing I want to talk a little bit about sort of the nitty gritty. I want to talk about the process of getting it started, the challenges that you experienced. Did you start the podcast off with like an overall goal for your growth? Was it intended for a specific purpose, or was it just something you wanted to do? You were bored one day and you're like, oh, I'm going to do a podcast. Or did you have a specific strategy in mind?
Well, I wish I had that much intentionality. And it is good to have that. It is good to have a plan. It's always good to have a plan. But in podcasting, it's more serendipitous, so you don't know where it's going to go. But you have to remember there's a background to this, you know. So I've done print interviews for years with interesting people in the family office space. I've always enjoyed listening to interviews and reading things like the Paris Review was actually a big influence on this. Um, Book Market Wizards by Jack Schwager. It's a famous book from the 80s where he interviews all these traders, and that was definitely an influence. Um, Things like Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose was an amazing format where it was just an interviewer in an empty room with the person, and it was a half an hour to an hour, and was great about that show, especially if you knew the author or the person being interviewed, that they would be intently focused on them and would know as much about them as possible, and this would be a very high quality interview. And those were some of the influences. I would also point out when I was in school, I used to love to read books, and you could write to the author or email the authors. And in many cases, if they lived up in Massachusetts, you could go and talk to them. And of course, authors love to talk to people who've read their books. So I found that if I had this kind of curiosity, I'm sure lots of other people would as well. So I already had some practice in going and trying to pick people's brains, and also try to give them an opportunity to kind of learn what people are interested in. And so that was kind of the ultimate impetus to it. So it wasn't a big lift to get into it, and it wasn't a big lift from the technology side. I think there is a certain amount of intimidation, especially I would advise people who are thinking about doing podcasting to not go online and read a bunch of articles about podcasting, because a lot of them are designed to sell you things. Some of them are good, obviously, and maybe read one or two of them, but you don't know much. I was very lucky. I spoke to a wonderful podcast editor early on. He said, "Yeah, don't pay any attention to that. Just get yourself a recorder and some microphones, and off you go. Get yourself a Spotify account. Don't stress too much about the promotion piece. Let that kind of happen organically. You'll learn how these platforms work. And over time, you'll get, you don't have to have TikTok like right out of the gate. You don't have to have an Instagram account. Those things will come over time. What's more important is that you focus intently on very high quality content, and doing as much research as you can before you actually talk to the guest so that you have some framework for talking to them. And then just, getting a good recording. So a lot of the things that might typically intimidate a person, like I'm not going to build a Bloomberg studio with cameras, and have producers and writers and all that. You don't need that. I mean, to your point, you were saying before, even if you have 100 people listening to you, you're sitting at your desk. I'm doing this off my kitchen table, and I've flown across country so I could speak to 300 people. If you get on a podcast or you do a podcast, you're going to reach multiples of that. And it's and it's a comfortable environment. It's easy to do. It's an easy conversation. You're talking to really interesting people. So and you probably know more people than you think is another one. People are like, oh, who am I going to have on? I
Right.
don't know anybody. I'll just get one person and that'll be it. There's so many people that you can talk to, and people. This is another thing about the maturation of social media and digital media is people know what a podcast is. Even 10 years ago, if I had called somebody up and said, hey, you want to be on a podcast? They'd be like, what's that? But everybody listens to them now. They're ubiquitous. And they're not a tough sell, because a lot of people have Rosemaries in their life who are pushing them to get on podcasts. and to get out more, and helping them realize that it's not very difficult.
I would agree with that. And even without the Rosemarys of the world sort of pushing them into doing it, I think all of us realize the power of podcasting. Many of us are podcast enthusiasts, and it really stems from our own interests and our own time and our own flexibility and the ability to sit down and feel as though you're participating in an actual conversation with these people, which is really profound. One of my favorite episodes that you did was with Jay Hughes, and that conversation. I think that, I have sort of cut my teeth hearing Jay Hughes's words and reading his words in the wealth management industry. You sat down with him, you had an in-depth conversation in front of an audience. I thought that was so cool, and to be able to listen to that in front of a general audience, you don't have to be there. I think that's extremely powerful, and I think that it's empowering not only for you and for your people who you're speaking in front of immediately. I think it's empowering for everyone who gets access to that information. So for our advisors that we sort of encourage to do these podcasts, it's about helping people understand these critical pieces of information that they need in order to make sound decisions about their wealth management, about their finances, about their families, about the decisions that come with a life of wealth. And I think that is very appealing on a broad scale. I think the majority of our advisors, they get into their work because they like helping people. And this allows them to do it on a much broader level and a higher platform. I am curious to know, when we first spoke about doing the podcast, you told me that, and I was so interested in what you had to say about how you had grown your podcast, because at that point you had thousands of people listening. And you said the only thing you did in the very beginning was email people. And when I talk to people about starting a podcast, they're very surprised by that. I actually tell them that little anecdote, and I'm like, I know this person who did a podcast, and he just launched it by emailing everyone he knew. And I'd like to know a little bit more about, has your approach evolved at all? Do you do any advertising? Do you do anything beyond just organic posting of this on your LinkedIn page, which I have seen? I'm curious to know if you've ever put any intentional effort towards promotion.
You do have to think about promotion, but like I said, it's something that comes later, and it's something you probably shouldn't stress too much about early on. There, a lot of folks will encourage you to really, really push the promotion hard, but there is this organic aspect to it that kind of has to happen. But if you think about it, if you're going to starting cold, if you don't already have a platform, if you're not an author or you have a television show or whatever, who do you know? It's the people in your network, and those people would be most likely interested in listening to you. And so if you send them an email and say, I'm interviewing this interesting person, yeah, why not? I'll listen to that. And those folks, there's the old saw about the 100 dedicated fans is worth more than 10,000. And that's how you start. Those are the people who are podcasting is really interesting, by the way, if you want to look at it versus other platforms, because it's very hard for it to go viral. It's very hard to know who's actually listening, and it's outside of sending it to somebody directly or having them subscribe. It doesn't have that kind of viral linkage that something might have on X or something might have on Facebook or TikTok. So there's not a natural way that these things are getting passed around. So it's people telling you. And how many times have you asked people, you're like, what shows are you watching? What podcasts are you listening to? And I think that's how I found out about most of the podcasts that I listen to. It's because people have told me about it. So how are you going to find those people? Well, the people who are most likely to do that are the people that you already know. And then obviously take advantage of the platforms, even if you don't understand them. And that's the funny thing is all the platforms have a different personality. What works on Instagram does not work on X, does not work on Blue Sky, etc. And you should be on all those networks. There was a wonderful, this woman was very helpful to me early on. She does the podcasts up at HBS, and she had a Pinterest account. And I was like, Pinterest, who's finding podcasts on Pinterest? She said, it's SEO. Pinterest comes up very high in Google search. So why not? You're already making the post, so put it on there. And that's kind of how most people start. So they'll make the post for LinkedIn and then they'll put it on X or they'll put it on Instagram, whatever. And that's great. That's how you do it. And eventually you'll find the places that work for you, but ultimately you want to have enough out there so that it's going to come up during a search. Now, obviously, the best thing that happens, um, and this is a good back to Sebastian Mallaby, is Sebastian had just written a book. And so a lot of people were searching for him. And what was amazing was when I put that podcast up, for the first couple of days, Google defaulted to that podcast because this was the most recent thing that had come out about that book. So when people were searching for him, they found that. And so you always have to kind of keep that in mind. Now, as you grow, you can get into, I haven't done any advertising, but yeah, absolutely. You can do AdWords, you can do all that stuff, but that's really expensive. And that's more if this was a business. You're trying to grow this, especially from a wealth management perspective, you're trying to grow this organically. And the best ways to do that are through email and through posting on social media and through getting on other people's podcasts. And that's the great thing about podcasters is they want good guests. And some of the best guests are people who already have a podcast. Or the other one that works great is newsletters. If you have a newsletter, you should find somebody who also is in the space and co-promote your newsletter with them. And that's what's kind of cool and interesting about the digital media space is it's not like hyper competitive the way traditional media is. People like to help each other out. If you're trying to mine this deep niche and I'm trying to mine this deep niche, I don't really think of these people as competitors. What we're trying to do is just create awareness. I mean, if you think about especially the family office space, I mean, it's such a tiny little niche ultimately. So the best way to do that is to collaborate with other folks, and that works wonders.
And then you get to sort of leverage their network and they leverage your network, and it's sort of this virtuous cycle that sort of feeds on itself. I am curious to know what impact this podcast has had on your professional career.
Well, it's been fabulous because one of the things that's interesting is that you have this kind of virtual network. And I think people learn this early on with social media is that social media keeps you in front of people, even if you're not physically in front of them. And so there's people who I haven't talked to in probably 10, 15 years, but I see them on social media, so I know what they're up to. And that's great because I mean, I'd love to be in touch with them, but I can't. But I know what they're up to. So when I run into them in the city, I'll be like, oh, hey, I saw you, you're at Goldman now. That's fantastic. And that's one of the wonderful things about having an online presence in general. And especially, like I said, that there's a certain amount of magnetism to this because people are attracted to the content. And this is what's super important because if I just went out and put up a bunch of flyers and said, hey, I have a family office network, you should join, then okay, great. But if you're bringing the folks in through the intellectual content window, if they're like, are you interested in this? Then you would obviously be interested in these other podcasts, and you would probably be interested in the speakers that we have in a conference, and you'll probably be interested in the other people who are at the conference. So now you have this online presence. You've also given yourself a tremendous amount of credibility because you've shown the world your portfolio. Here's what I'm interested in. Are you interested in this too? Fantastic. You and I are going to get along. And this is the journey that I'm on. I'm going to be exploring investment decision making. I'm going to be exploring the family issues around a family office. And there's a lot of folks who are very curious about that. So they're going to come along on the ride with you. So it's in the podcast, and the podcast itself is kind of integral. The format of the podcast is integral to that. The way that you do these interviews, the way that you learn from people by basically just listening to them and asking them about things that, what are you doing in your work and what's of interest to you? That's really compelling. And so that format sets the tone for the group in somewhat in a way that like TED many years ago kind of set that format, became a whole thing. It's like 15 minutes, it's kind of a big topic, but it's bite-sized and it's got a lot of syrup on it. So great, I'll have that. But I think people want more than that. And so the podcast influences the live events. So actually, at my most recent event, I interviewed Zoe Cruz, former co-president of Morgan Stanley. She's absolutely fabulous. What an interesting person. And then that became a podcast. And so if you think about, you're starting to see this in in the conference space, things like Future Proof,
Yeah.
and the stuff that we do and what lots of other folks do is that the panels themselves become like a podcast format. It's more trying to get at the intellectual content because that's what people are hungry for. These are busy people. They're curious people. They don't have a lot of time, but at the same time, they really wish they had time to read books. They really wish they had time to go deep into a topic that's of interest to them. And they certainly want to know what other people think about that topic. So if you're working in a family office, as I've said a million times, family offices are kind of isolating. You're a little bit out of the loop. And so you want to feel like you're at least finding what's out there consensus wise, but also, what are other smart people thinking? And, do I think that maybe I should reconsider this? Maybe here's some books that I should read. So all of this is integral to that ultimate kind of flywheel that the ideas come in, the guests come in, and the families come in, the members of the group. They want connection, but they also want this high quality content. And you're basically doing it. First of all, you're doing it for yourself. Like it's your own curiosity. You need to follow your own curiosity when you're doing a podcast. I wouldn't start doing a podcast about naval history. I don't know anything about naval history. I know something about family offices, and I'm really curious to learn more about it. And I want to find not just anybody, but I want to find people who can analyze it and synthesize the information and kind of compress all that ambiguity that's out there because I don't have time to do it. I've got 20 other things to do. So if I could listen to an hour podcast on, AI and venture capital, that's fabulous. Now I'm up to speed. I just heard it from, somebody who's actually out there doing this every day. I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do the research, but this person has. And so that's wonderful. That's like a superpower. When I was in the family office, 20, 25 years ago, everything was on paper.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't go to the conference, if you went to the conference and you didn't see the panel, you didn't hear the panel. That was it. And there wasn't any podcasting. So now I think it's integral not only into what I'm doing and how I engage with the world, but how people just are doing this in general. You've increased this kind of epistemic network. You've increased your knowledge base, and now you're constantly learning.
And I would say, to piggyback off that, we are in an age of transparency. People want more. They want more information, but they are so busy. They can't sit down and read a 15-page paper the way that we used to do. And I think one of the most powerful testimonials that I've ever heard is when we have a client, a partner firm who we work with, we do their podcast, and they told me that someone found their website and this person eventually called them and they said, we listened to your podcast and we felt like we knew you before we even called you. We felt like we knew all about you and we were friends just from listening to you on the podcast. And that helped them to make the decision to move forward. And so many people don't understand the power of that transparency and the power of delivering that knowledge to a broad audience. And I think you hit on it exactly right? So being able to transfer that knowledge and sit down with someone who is an expert in whatever the topic is extremely powerful. So wrapping up, I would love to know, we've talked about a lot of things all on the virtues of podcasting. Curious to know, did we leave anything out? Is there anything that you feel like we should mention that we didn't speak about?
Well, there's quite a bit. I think what you were saying, good marketing means you don't have to explain yourself in meetings. That's absolutely true.
100%.
And I always think about, in the case of a podcast, it's kind of like having a first meeting with a manager, but in my mind, it's actually, you're really trying to move it up to the second meeting because you're skipping a lot of the preliminary stuff, and back when I was interviewing managers, the first meeting was usually, it was kind of a bit of a slog. You actually had to go through a lot of kind of detailed information. And I was always trying to get past that. Because what I really wanted to know was, what is this person like? I'm going to give this person a bunch of money. What's going on here? How do they think about the world? I don't want to know how many computers they have. I don't know how many offices they have. I actually don't even want to know about their investment philosophy as explained in like 5 minutes.
Right.
I actually want to hear them talk me through a company that they purchased, talk me through a stock that they bought, talk me through a crisis that they went through. because you're going to learn an awful lot more about them that way than just the typical first meeting, which is kind of rigid.
Totally.
Um,
And you,
and so,
oh,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's what, and this is what the benefit of being on a podcast or doing a podcast is you don't have to do that first meeting anymore because you already know. And I do this with my guests because the great thing is about podcasting is they've been on other podcasts and I can listen to that before I talk to them. So I'm already up to speed. And I think one of the interesting things that I've learned along the way with podcasts is how important it is to calibrate with your guest because your guest doesn't know what you're going to ask them. And usually, if you're a good interviewer, you're going to kind of get past the typical journalistic questions and kind of go deep. And so there is always a certain like 10, 15 minutes of calibration where the person's kind of figuring out, where you're coming from and what level of resolution they should deliver this information because they're working obviously at a very high level. What is your audience like? So they can tell from your questions. But some of that is just social. It's just getting the person to relax and feel comfortable. And this is an open forum. All of this will be edited. You can, and we're really interested in how you think. And so if you want to tell us a story, that would be fabulous. If you want to give us details, that would be fantastic. And the other thing that's great, and I think we've already covered it to some extent, is that your good marketing is your reach, and it's really hard, especially in wealth management, to differentiate yourself, and to actually get to where the client is. And often when people get to where the client is, they just want to talk about their firm and just try to get it across to them, what they do, and that doesn't resonate with the
No.
client.
Mm-mm.
They don't remember that.
Mm-mm.
Whereas if they've listened to you on an interview, and I've interviewed people, and I interviewed David Salem. I talked to him for 3 hours. I don't think we talked about his current company, Hedgeye, once. We didn't even get to it. But if you listen to that podcast, you're like, what does this guy do? I got to find out. This guy's really interesting. And all the funds and people that I've interviewed have been like that. You hardly ever talk about the firm. You're just talking about their interests, and that's what really captures people. And the other thing is just visibility. And you're trying to, again, with wealth management, because it's hard to differentiate, but even asset management is like this. You can get, and you want private equity with any flavor you want, any color you want. So how are you going to create preference? There's dozens and hundreds of quant funds, but there's only one AQR, and people know if I mention AQR to somebody, then oh yeah, Cliff Asness, he's a really interesting guy, and they write a lot of research. They're an amazing firm. That's creates preference, or at least it distinguishes you. You're like, well, I want a long short fund. I don't want AQR, or maybe I want AQR. But you wouldn't get that if you hadn't listened to that interview and you didn't know a little bit something about these firms. The other big takeaway is, I would say, if you're going to do this, then start today. You go find your people. The worst thing that can happen is you'll learn something.
100%. Just jump right in. I think that what you said, which resonates with me so much, you sort of get past that deck. You get past the marketing speak. You get past, all of the certifications and all of the things that you do and all of the qualifications that you have as a firm. This allows people to go really deep in a very easy. It's an easy to do thing to listen to someone having a conversation. And I think that that's so important. You are getting to a level of authenticity that has not been possible without attending an in-person event or having that conversation in person. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we see podcasting is just exploding in terms of content delivery. It's because people are craving that authenticity. They're craving the information. So for the advisors that we work with that are actually doing a podcast, we're seeing that people are coming to them saying, we know you. I feel like we're friends. And I think that that's really cool. Like you said, it gets you right past all that marketing speak. It's the only way I've ever seen to truly communicate a value proposition, exactly it is that you do. I've gone running around with people trying to write website text because they just feel it doesn't capture their value proposition, and that's the truth. You can't capture a value proposition of the things that you do for a family in a paragraph this big on a website. Really have to tell the stories, and I think that's something that you've been doing for decades, right? Is telling stories and listening to stories, and that this is just the latest manifestation of that.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on this podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you. I'm really excited for you that your podcast has exploded in the way that it has. I've enjoyed following it, I've enjoyed listening to it. I think it's extremely well produced, and I think you've done an awesome job. So, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and thank you for the opportunity. This has been fabulous.